Is Doctor Who a cyclical thing? I was around in 1989 when the classic series, unbeknownst to us at the time, came to an end. There was no fanfare, no official announcement. Doctor Who just disappeared from television screens for the next 7 years, only to appear once in 1996 before being resurrected in 2005. When looking at the classic series, there was a clear decline during its final decade. The loss in viewership began with a slight dip in the early 80s, and this became a gaping chasm by the end of the decade. Even a brilliant season in 1989 was not enough to bring viewers back. Unfortunately, we have also seen a similar trend in terms of loss of viewership with New Who, which can be traced back to 2010. But this is not the only similarity between these two eras. In fact, if we look at Doctors 3 through 7 and compare it to Doctors 9 through 13, we can see a definite pattern. Actually, we could say that history is repeating itself. First, let's start with Doctors 3 through 9. Both Jon Pertwee and Christopher Eccleston had the monumental task of making Doctor Who relevant again. First, let's take a look at the state of Doctor Who at the end of the 1960s. While Patrick Troughton is one of my favorite Doctors, the show was definitely in a state of decline. The ratings were down, and repeating themes, particularly base under siege stories, had become stale. Both fans and the BBC wanted something new. Series 7 was a make-or-break year for the show. If Pertwee, along with producer Barry Letts and script editor Terrance Dicks, failed, it's likely that Doctor Who would now simply be known as archive TV from a bygone era. Luckily, Pertwee's charisma, coupled with a new narrative which placed a much greater emphasis on earthbound stories, along with the brilliance of Letts and Dicks, Doctor Who began the golden era of the 1970s. The Eccleston Era faced a similar challenge. Between 1989 and 2005, there had been only one televised outing for the Doctor, the 1996 American-made Canadian film TV movie. And although Paul McGann was an excellent Doctor, the movie itself was not really an example of first-rate Doctor Who. Eccleston, along with new showrunner Russell T Davies, faced the task of introducing Doctor Who to a new generation. This was Doctor Who's final make-or-break moment. If it failed, it was highly unlikely we would ever see it come back again. Luckily, just as in 1970, this new iteration of Who became an instant hit. The show also reflected the Pertwee era in that it predominantly centered on earthbound stories and introduced a new generation to UNIT. Eccleston's introductory episode featured the Autons, originally introduced during the Pertwee era. There are also similarities between these two Doctors. Both reflected the more serious side of the Doctor's personality. Indeed, both could be charming and humorous, but you would probably not want to cross either of them. Both had also been damaged by recent events. Doctor Number 3, at least in the beginning, had found himself stranded on Earth, unable to use the TARDIS, and Doctor Number 9 was traumatized by the events of the Time War. And although both eras are decades apart, they share a distinctly similar vibe, and budgetary concerns dictated that both eras had to focus on good stories rather than having to rely solely on visual effects. When Pertwee left after 5 years and Eccleston left after only 1, many fans feared that this might be the end. Both actors had such a strong presence, and it had such a monumental impact on the success of Doctor Who, there was a fear that this may have been a lightning in a bottle situation, and the show would see a significant diminishment in quality, and boy were they wrong. When most people, both Who fans and the general public alike, think of the quintessential Doctor, more often than not, two actors come to mind: Tom Baker and David Tennant. Both were juggernauts of epic proportions in the role, and, like it or not, both defined Doctor Who for their respective generations. These two actors were responsible for transforming Doctor Who into an international phenomenon during two very different and distinct time periods. Not only were the two actors powerhouses in their own right, but they were also complemented by the most successful and highly regarded showrunners in Doctor Who history. Philip Hinchcliffe, who produced Baker's first 3 seasons, along with Robert Holmes as script editor, were the geniuses who gave us the gothic horror-inspired era of Who, an era which, in my opinion, has yet to be bested. Russell T Davies, who gave us Series 1, propelled Doctor Who to new heights of popularity that would have been unimaginable only a few years before. Davies was also supported by a brilliant writing team, including this person, but we'll cover more on that later. Of course, neither of these eras were perfect. For example, I think the inclusion of farting aliens so early in the show's run was a definite mistake, and who could forget the occasional universally derided clunker like Fear Her. The Baker era also had the Graham Williams years, which, while indeed featuring some very strong love stories like City of Death, also featured missteps like Underworld. The Williams era also saw Tom Baker's eccentric humor getting out of hand, particularly during his 6th season. Regardless, we cannot deny the impact of both these eras, and when it was announced that both actors were leaving the show, many thought, once again, this would be the end of Doctor Who. In fact, the BBC actually considered ending the show after Tennant's run because the corporation didn't think anyone could ever replace him, and the show was doomed. This brings us to Doctors number 5 and 11. Both were, at the time, the youngest actors ever to take on the role, and both casting announcements were met with a great deal of skepticism. For example, many wondered how Tristan from All Creatures Great and Small could take on the mantle of Doctor Who. And does anyone remember the very badly handled introduction of Matt Smith? They both also had the seemingly insurmountable task of following Baker and Tennant, respectively, and both defied expectations. Despite these similarities, however, the approach both doctors took differed widely. While Peter Davison gave us a much more subtle interpretation of the Doctor, Smith would often turn the comedy and eccentricity to 10. I think we can argue that, while both were very strong doctors, neither entirely lived up to their predecessors. But indeed, I don't think any actor ever could. This is, of course, my own opinion, and if yours differs, that's perfectly fine. Regardless, I think it's a credit to both actors that the show did survive both these transition periods. Another important thread that links these two eras were the showrunners, and this introduced us to the conundrum that is John Nathan Turner and Stephen Moffat. Both started their tenures on a historic high, both stayed way too long, and both saw the show diminish in popularity significantly by the end of their tenures. They were also both intimately familiar with the show, having been involved with Doctor Who prior to taking the reins. Let's start with JNT, whose tenure actually began with Tom Baker's final season. Many aspects of the show were in need of major updating. What he gave us was a complete reinvention of Doctor Who. The tone was different, the visuals were different, the music was different, the stories went the science fiction route, and Baker's comedy was greatly toned down. This continued into the Davison era, which I think was better suited to JNT's style. Davison's first season was probably one of the strongest in Who history, giving us classics like The Visitation and Earthshock. We'll just pretend that Time Flight doesn't exist for the moment. There are many parallels between this and the launch of the Stephen Moffat era during Matt Smith's first series. However, Moffat's task may have been more challenging than JNT's. While JNT had the advantage of ushering in a new era during the twilight of an already famous Doctor, Moffat had to work with an entirely new Doctor and assistant. Moffat and Smith exceeded expectations, and the 11th hour was nothing short of perfection. Most doubts were quelled almost instantly when Matt Smith came on the screen, and, at least in his first story, he was nothing short of perfection. Series 5 was a success, and proved to be one of the strongest in Who history. Unfortunately, both eras would run into problems, although the Smith era probably had more than Davison's. For Davison, the problems came the end of his first season into his second season. While it still had some strong stories, it paled in comparison to his first and what would be later his third series. The problem, however, was not so much the quality of the show, but its popularity. Davison's second and third series saw a drop in ratings, and this was the beginning of a trend that would ultimately culminate in the show's cancellation almost a decade later. Take a look at the relatively strong ratings for Davison's first series. Now look at the change in his second, and now his third. The problems inherent to the Matt Smith era are a little bit more complex. Firstly, let's look at the ratings. While Smith's first series did very well, it did not entirely live up to Series 4, and was definitely lower than the Tennant specials the year before. Regardless, while the ratings were lower, They held relatively steady for Smith's entire tenure. A big problem, however, was Stephen Moffat. Moffat was undeniably a strong writer, probably the strongest writer during the Davies era, giving us the masterpieces that were The Empty Child, The Doctor Dances, The Girl in the Fireplace, Blink, Silence in the Library, and Forest of the Dead. He is a genius when it comes to the darker elements of Doctor Who. It is also undeniable that this trend of writing masterpieces did continue into his own era with stories like Listen and Heaven Sent. Unfortunately, Moffat is not strong when it comes to writing lighter episodes, which was something that Davies excelled at. I mean, just look at the unmitigated disasters like The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe, or The Return of Dr. Mysterio. Moreover, his complex writing, which worked masterfully in Blink, did not translate well when it was presented as a series-long arc. Generally, the audience was just left confused in the end, particularly during Series 6. The 2 split seasons didn't help matters, and I think we can all agree that his 3rd season is actually 2 separate seasons in almost every way possible. I've always considered this just a way of avoiding the possible backlash had the BBC actually announced that the 2012 year would consist of only 5 episodes and a Christmas special. Despite these deficiencies, I think we can still call the Davison and Smith eras a success. While they didn't entirely live up to their predecessors, they still managed to capture the audience, and it was actually during the Smith era that Doctor Who exploded in the United States. This then leads us to the tragedy that was both the 6th and 12th Doctors, and the similarities between these 2 eras are staggering. In my opinion, Colin Baker and Peter Capaldi were perhaps the 2 best actors to ever be cast as the Doctor, and both were horribly mistreated. Both were intended to be a complete reinvention of the show, and both ended on a distinct down note. First, let's start off with Baker. The 5th Doctor had been the friendly, down-to-earth Doctor, underplayed with brilliance by Peter Davison, and many considered Davison's Doctor to be the most human of all the incarnations. J&T wanted to go in an entirely different direction with the character that harkened back more to the original Hartnell personification. The idea was to cast a much harsher Doctor that would slowly mellow throughout his run, and the casting of Colin Baker was a work of genius, but the implementation was a disaster. Also, Baker, a massive Doctor Who fan, intended to be in the role for a long time. Indeed, the plan had been to surpass Tom Baker's record-breaking 7-year run. Unfortunately, history and the BBC had other plans. Colin Baker's introduction was an unmitigated disaster. His first story, The Twin Dilemma, was shown at the end of Peter Davison's final season, and right after The Caves of Androzani, considered by many to be the best story in Doctor Who history. The story was horrible. The costume, actually drawn as a joke by the costume designer, was an absolute joke. The Doctor was completely unlikable, and then the Doctor strangles his companion. And this was the impression the audience was left with for 10 months, as that's how long it took before Baker's first season came to air. Conversely, however, his first full season, time lash aside, was a work of brilliance. It took the show in a new, more adult direction, and with his regenerative psychosis gone, we were introduced to a much more serious version of the 6th Doctor, although the ridiculous costume was still present. Now let's look at the introduction of Peter Capaldi, which fared somewhat better, at least as far as the introductory episode is concerned. Deep Breath, unlike The Twin Dilemma, was a very strong story, which successfully introduced the world to a radically different Doctor. This was the Doctor that classic series fans had been waiting for. I think Moffat's grand plan was to introduce 2 completely different interpretations of the Doctor during his run. Whereas Smith was perhaps the jokiest version of the Doctor, the Series 8 version of the 12th Doctor was perhaps the most hardcore interpretation we had ever seen, and this was a refreshing change. Series 8, just like Season 22, was brilliant, and the Doctor was played to perfection by Capaldi. Also, during Series 8, the ratings were consistent with the Matt Smith era. The ratings for Colin Baker's first season were also consistent with the Peter Davison era, and the quality was maintained. Then things went horribly awry for both Doctors. For Colin Baker, the major problems began with the 1985 hiatus, which saw Doctor Who go off the air for 18 months, thanks to Michael Grade. When Doctor Who came back to our screens, it returned with a diminished budget and an episode count that had been cut in half. Also, while many, including myself, actually like the Trial of a Time Lord story arc, it's clear that the quality was not as consistent as JNT's previous 5 seasons. The ratings also experienced a massive dip over season 22. The show was also hampered by an internal war between JNT and script editor Eric Sayward, which saw the Trial of a Time Lord story arc end on a massive disappointment, and our last image of the Sixth Doctor on screen was hearing him moan about carrot juice. Subsequently, Colin Baker was fired, and his character arc was never completed, resulting in the shortest overall episode count until the Christopher Eccleston era 2 decades later. Of course, Baker was able to complete his character arc in the Big Finish audios, but the focus here is the television series. Now back to the Capaldi era. My theory is that there had been pushback from the BBC regarding the harshness of the 12th Doctor during Series 8, and this resulted in completely changing the Doctor's personality. For instance, compare the Doctor we see in Series 8 to the one we see in Series 9 and 10. Capaldi seems to be playing a completely different character. Unfortunately, the end result seemed to be that the 12th Doctor lacked any clear direction, and he seemed to be morphing into Matt Smith, which did not take advantage of Capaldi's particular talents. Furthermore, the fact that Doctor Who was off the screens for almost the entirety of 2016, minus one god-awful Christmas special, did not help matters. It was also during Series 9 that PC culture became firmly implanted in Doctor Who. Now, Doctor Who has always been a commentary on what was occurring in the real world at the time, but in the past this was done with subtlety, metaphor, and satire. Now it appeared that it was mandated that at various points the action would almost be halted to deliver a 1 or 2 line morality tale, and in some cases an entire episode would be devoted to this. Gone was the subtlety. Now audiences were being beaten over the head with social justice and third-wave feminist narratives, focusing heavily on identity politics. Now, let's look at the writing. Series 9 consisted of generally unsatisfying 2-part stories, with a mind-bogglingly weak hybrid story arc. I mean, really, Moffat? That's the best you could come up with? The PC narrative in New Who became even more overt in Series 10. There was also the problem that Moffat appeared to be attempting to copy RTD's style with mixed results. Also, just like the end of the Colin Baker era, the ratings started to fall through the floor. The drop started in Series 9, and while not disastrous, it was clear that the show was losing popularity fast. The ratings loss would become a gaping wound during Series 10, and the record for lowest rated episode of New Who ever would be broken several times. From my perspective, it's still unclear as to why Peter Capaldi suddenly announced he was leaving. Like Colin Baker, his plan had been to stay in the role for a very long time. My own theory, although keep in mind this is just a theory as nothing has been proven, is that Capaldi was forced out by the progressivist agenda that seems to be forming for the Chris Chibnall era. Now we go to Doctors 7 and 13. Sylvester Mccoy was cast under a cloud of controversy. Not only had the previous Doctor been shown the door, but many fans questioned whether an actor known primarily for pantomime and children's shows could successfully take on the role of the Doctor. This was also in addition to a companion introduced the previous year that had not gone over well. And, just like the Twin Dilemma, Time and the Ronnie, McCoy's introductory episode, is also considered to be amongst the worst in Doctor Who history. The remainder of Season 24 was not much better, and the ratings maintained the same low levels of the Trial of a Time Lord season. The McCoy era did improve drastically, and Season 26 is one of my personal favorites, but unfortunately its premiere episode, Battlefield Part 1, is to date the lowest rated episode in Doctor Who history. Ratings did not improve much, and Classic Who was quietly put to rest. The current situation could potentially become much worse than 1989. When the classic series went off the air, there wasn't really much animosity towards the program. While there was a clear drop in quality early in the McCoy era, many fans simply moved on to other things. Doctor Who was a show that had once been great, but had now run its course. Many people weren't even aware that the show had been cancelled, as the BBC never made an official announcement. It just went quietly into the night. In retrospect, this was perhaps the best way for the show to go out, and it set the stage for Doctor Who's triumphant return 16 years later. Now, in 2017, we find ourselves in a very troubling spot. The casting of the 13th Doctor has proven to be the most controversial in Doctor Who history, As I've stated in other videos, the problem is not with the casting choice, but the motivations behind it. Many fans feel that progressive Doctor Who is going to go into overdrive and the show will lose more of its audience share. Moreover, the BBC and those behind Doctor Who are aggressively denying the existence of a backlash, despite the fact that Doctor Who fandom now seems to be cut in half. Some are also outright abusive towards those that demonstrate even the slightest degree of negativity towards the casting. Doctor Who has been renewed for 5 years, and if the quality starts to dip even further, this could be the end of the franchise. 5 years is a long time, and the damage done to the Who brand if this progressive course continues, and I underscore the word if, could be irreparable. Many fans will walk away from the show forever. But, as nothing has yet been shot, we don't know how this will work out. We can surely ask the question, is this going to be the final chapter of Doctor Who? Only time will tell. I sincerely hope the show changes its course, and Chris Chibnall and Jodie Whittaker focus on stories and not feminism, social justice, and identity politics. And that's it for this video. So as always everyone, thank you for watching, and have a great day.